My wife ended our marriage, kicked me out, and took everything. But 3 months later, I won $840 million on TV. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Before we dive into today's story, I'd like to ask you for a quick favor. If you enjoy our content, please subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you'll always be the first to know when we upload a new video. It only takes a moment, costs nothing, and is one of the best ways to help us continue creating touching and unforgettable stories for you. We truly appreciate your support. Also, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Share your city or country in the comments below so we can say hello to viewers from around the world. Thank you so much for being here. Now, without further ado, let's return to our main character and begin today's story. The cruelest betrayals are never shouted across a room. They arrive with a signature at the bottom of a page. Marcus Reed stared at the divorce papers one last time before setting the pen down on the polished oak table. Outside the attorney's office, downtown Atlanta hummed with its usual Monday afternoon rhythm. But inside, everything had fallen unnaturally quiet. Vanessa never looked at him. She simply gathered her designer handbag, thanked her lawyer with a smile that carried no warmth, and walked toward the door as if she had just finished another business meeting. 11 years of marriage had been reduced to a stack of legal documents and a silence heavier than any argument they had ever shared. Marcus remained seated for a moment, listening to the ticking clock mounted on the wall. Each second sounded louder than the last. When he finally stepped outside, the summer heat wrapped around him, but it did nothing to soften the emptiness settling into his chest. He reached into his pocket for his house keys out of habit before remembering they no longer belonged to him. By the time he drove across town to the home they had once bought together, the locks had already been changed. 2 cardboard boxes waited neatly on the front porch. One held his clothes. The other contained framed family photographs, a pair of worn work boots, a coffee mug chipped along the rim, and the old baseball glove his father had given him when he was 12. The rest was gone. His pickup truck, legally his before the settlement, had already been transferred. Their joint savings account had been divided exactly as the attorneys negotiated. Even the golden retriever they had adopted years earlier stayed behind because Vanessa insisted the dog belonged with the house. Marcus stood on the sidewalk holding one of the boxes while neighbors pretended not to notice. Curtains shifted. A garage door opened, then closed again. Nobody said a word. Across the street, a delivery driver slowed just enough to glance at the man who no longer belonged there. Marcus never knocked on the door. He never raised his voice. Through the living room window, he caught a glimpse of Vanessa speaking with an interior designer, pointing toward the furniture they had once picked out together during a weekend road trip. She looked relieved, almost excited, as though she had been waiting years for this afternoon to arrive. Marcus quietly loaded the boxes into the back seat of the aging sedan he had borrowed from his cousin. Before climbing inside, he looked at the front porch one final time. Every memory seemed trapped behind that bright red door. The Thanksgiving dinners, birthday candles, movie nights, and dreams they had whispered while believing forever was guaranteed. He started the engine, but his phone vibrated before he could pull away. A message from Vanessa appeared on the screen. "I think it's better if we don't contact each other anymore. It's time for both of us to move on." There was no anger in the words, only finality. Marcus read the sentence twice before placing the phone face down on the passenger seat. Rain clouds gathered overhead, dimming the afternoon sunlight until the neighborhood looked almost unfamiliar. As the first drops struck the windshield, he drove away without knowing where he would spend the night, carrying little more than 2 boxes, an empty bank account, and the painful certainty that the life he had spent over a decade building had disappeared in a single afternoon. Marcus drove until the fuel gauge dipped below a quarter of a tank before pulling into the parking lot of a roadside motel on the edge of the city. The faded neon sign buzzed overhead, and the front desk clerk barely looked up as he counted the cash Marcus slid across the counter. The room smelled faintly of old carpet and industrial cleaner, but it had a bed, a shower, and a door that locked. That was enough for the first night. The next morning, sunlight slipped through a gap in the curtains long before his alarm sounded. For a few quiet seconds, he forgot where he was. Then he reached toward the empty side of the bed without thinking, and reality settled over him once again. He folded the blanket neatly, packed the few belongings he still owned, and opened his banking application. The balance staring back at him was smaller than he had ever imagined possible after more than a decade of hard work. Every dollar suddenly carried weight. Every purchase became a decision. Instead of stopping for breakfast, he bought a cup of black coffee from a gas station and a banana that would have to last until lunch. Pride had become a luxury he could no longer afford. Marcus spent the next several days searching for work anywhere that would hire him quickly. He filled out applications at warehouses, grocery stores, shipping companies, restaurants, and auto shops. Most managers smiled politely before telling him they would call if something became available. Few ever did. Finally, he accepted a temporary delivery job using his cousin's aging sedan. It was not glamorous, but it paid enough to keep the motel room for another week. Every morning began before sunrise. He loaded packages, navigated traffic across Atlanta, climbed apartment stairs carrying boxes, and smiled at strangers who barely noticed his existence. Some customers thanked him warmly. Others accepted their deliveries without making eye contact. Marcus never complained. He simply moved on to the next address. During the quiet moments between deliveries, memories found him without warning. A billboard advertising luxury vacations reminded him of the anniversary trip he and Vanessa had once planned but never taken. A family laughing together outside an ice cream shop made him wonder if happiness could disappear as quickly as a signature on legal paper. Still, he kept driving. At night, exhaustion replaced sorrow. He returned to the motel with aching shoulders, microwaved a frozen dinner, and watched local news until sleep overtook him. He never searched Vanessa's social media. He never asked mutual friends how she was doing. Some chapters, he realized, only kept hurting if they were read over and over again. Weeks quietly passed. His beard grew thicker, his hands rougher, and the expensive dress shirts he used to wear were replaced by plain work clothes that smelled of cardboard and engine oil. Yet something unexpected also began to change. The silence no longer felt unbearable. He discovered a small park near the motel where he drank his morning coffee before work. Elderly neighbors walked their dogs. Children chased squirrels beneath tall oak trees. Life continued with or without his heartbreak, and for the first time since the divorce, Marcus allowed himself to believe that perhaps his own life could continue as well. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline and painted the clouds in deep shades of orange, his delivery application assigned him one final stop across town. It looked like an ordinary address, another routine package at the end of another ordinary day. Marcus had no way of knowing that opening the trunk for that last delivery would quietly place him on a path that would change everything he thought the future still held. The final delivery of the evening led Marcus to a modest brick house tucked away on a quiet street lined with towering maple trees. Warm yellow lights spilled through the front windows, and laughter drifted onto the porch before the door even opened. An elderly man with silver hair greeted him with an easy smile that felt unusually genuine. He accepted the package, thanked Marcus by name after reading his badge, and noticed the fatigue hidden behind his polite expression. Instead of closing the door immediately, the man asked if he would like a cold bottle of water because the weather had been brutally hot all week. Marcus hesitated for a second before accepting with quiet gratitude. The old man introduced himself as Walter Brooks and mentioned that he had once spent 30 years driving trucks across the Southeast. He recognized the look of someone carrying more than heavy boxes. Marcus smiled politely, but offered very little about his own life. Walter respected the silence. Before Marcus turned to leave, Walter reached into his mailbox and pulled out a colorful flyer that had arrived earlier that day. It advertised a nationally televised trivia and luck-based competition scheduled to film in Atlanta the following weekend. The grand prize printed across the top was so enormous that it almost looked unreal. Walter chuckled and shook his head. He admitted that he had planned to apply, but his health no longer allowed him to stand through long studio recordings. Then he folded the flyer in half and held it toward Marcus. At first, Marcus laughed softly and tried to hand it back. He told Walter those kinds of shows were for lucky people, not for men who spent their days delivering packages and counting every gallon of gasoline. Walter refused to take the paper. Instead, he looked Marcus directly in the eyes and said that sometimes the people with nothing left were the only ones willing to open the doors everyone else walked past. The sentence lingered in Marcus's mind long after he climbed back into the sedan. He placed the flyer on the passenger seat beneath his delivery scanner and continued the final route. Hours later, back in the motel room, he emptied his pockets onto the small table. His keys, a few crumpled dollar bills, the motel receipt, and the folded flyer. He almost threw it into the trash before stopping himself. The application required nothing more than an online form and a short personal interview. There was no entry fee, no complicated process, just a chance that seemed too unlikely to matter. Marcus stared at the ceiling for several minutes before opening his aging laptop. The internet connection in the motel was painfully slow, but eventually the application page appeared. It asked simple questions about his background, occupation, hobbies, and why America should care about his story. Marcus paused at the final question for a long time. He could have written about the divorce, the empty bank account, or losing the home he had built with his own hands. Instead, he typed a single sentence. I have learned that starting over is harder than giving up, but it is always worth trying. He read it twice, took a slow breath, and pressed the submit button without expecting anything to happen. After closing the laptop, he turned off the bedside lamp and let darkness fill the tiny room. Somewhere across the city, thousands of other people were probably applying for the same opportunity. Marcus believed he would wake up the next morning and continue delivering packages exactly as before. He had no idea that before sunrise, an email waiting quietly inside his inbox would become the first crack in the wall that fate had built around his life. The email arrived at 6:15 the next morning while Marcus was pouring instant coffee into a paper cup. At first, he assumed it was another automated rejection from one of the dozens of jobs he had applied for over the past month. Instead, the subject line made him stop breathing for a moment. It congratulated him on being selected as one of the contestants for the nationally televised competition. He read the message 3 times before he believed it was real. The producers requested that he arrive at the television studio in downtown Atlanta the following Saturday for orientation and preliminary interviews. Marcus almost convinced himself it had to be a scam, but after visiting the official website and calling the number listed in the email, every detail checked out. Saturday arrived with clear blue skies stretching across the city. Marcus borrowed his cousin's only blazer, polished a pair of shoes that had not seen formal use since the divorce, and drove toward the massive television studio with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Hundreds of contestants filled the lobby, each carrying their own dreams, fears, and stories. Some laughed confidently, while others rehearsed trivia questions beneath their breath. Marcus quietly took his place in line, feeling completely ordinary among strangers who all seemed convinced they belonged there. The producers moved everyone through interviews, paperwork, and camera tests with remarkable efficiency. When Marcus spoke about rebuilding his life after unexpected hardship, he noticed one producer lower her clipboard and listen more carefully than before. She smiled gently and thanked him for his honesty. Hours later, the contestants were escorted into the brightly lit studio for rehearsal. Giant screens surrounded the stage. Cameras glided silently across polished floors. Music echoed through the room as technicians adjusted lights that were brighter than anything Marcus had ever experienced. Every empty seat in the audience section would soon be filled with people eager to watch someone else's future change forever. When the live broadcast finally began that evening, the atmosphere transformed instantly. Applause thundered through the studio. The charismatic host welcomed millions of viewers across America before introducing the first round. Marcus answered question after question with calm determination. Years of reading history books borrowed from public libraries, solving crossword puzzles during lunch breaks, and learning through simple curiosity unexpectedly became his greatest advantage. One contestant after another was eliminated while Marcus quietly advanced. During commercial breaks, he closed his eyes, took slow breaths, and reminded himself that simply standing on this stage was already something he had never imagined possible. By the beginning of the final round, only Marcus and one other contestant remained beneath the brilliant lights. The audience leaned forward in anticipation. The host smiled as dramatic music slowly filled the studio. He explained that the championship would come down to one final question, a single answer that would decide whether someone walked away with the largest prize in the history of the program. Every camera turned toward Marcus. He could hear nothing except the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat. Somewhere beyond the stage, millions of viewers waited in complete silence. The host unfolded the final card, looked directly at Marcus, and slowly began reading the question that had the power to change one ordinary life forever. The studio became so quiet that Marcus could hear the faint hum of the lights above the stage. The host finished reading the final question, then gently placed the card on the podium and smiled with practiced patience. Every answer Marcus had given that evening came quickly, but this one demanded something different. He closed his eyes for a brief second, searching through years of forgotten facts buried somewhere beneath ordinary memories. Suddenly, he remembered reading a small article in a public library during one of his lunch breaks years earlier. It had seemed completely useless at the time, yet every detail returned with astonishing clarity. Marcus opened his eyes, looked directly at the host, and gave his answer in a calm, steady voice. For what felt like an eternity, nobody moved. The host glanced toward the judge's table, waiting for confirmation inside the earpiece hidden beneath his collar. The audience held its breath. Marcus stood perfectly still, refusing to guess whether he had just won everything or lost it all. Then the host's expression slowly changed. A smile spread across his face before he raised one hand high into the air. Confetti cannons erupted from both sides of the stage as the audience exploded into deafening applause. Bright golden lights swept across the studio while triumphant music filled every corner of the building. The giant screen behind Marcus illuminated with numbers so large they barely seemed real. $840 million. The largest prize ever awarded in the history of the program. Marcus did not scream. He did not jump. Instead, he covered his face with both hands as tears quietly escaped through his fingers. Months of humiliation, loneliness, uncertainty, and silent endurance seemed to leave his body all at once. The host walked over, placed a hand on his shoulder, and congratulated him as photographers rushed toward the stage. Marcus accepted the ceremonial check with trembling hands, still struggling to believe that the impossible had just happened. Across America, families watching television rose from their couches in amazement. Social media filled with clips of the emotional victory within minutes. News channels interrupted regular programming to report the unprecedented jackpot. Reporters immediately began searching for information about the quiet delivery driver who had become one of the wealthiest people in the country overnight. At that exact moment, several miles away in an upscale beauty salon, Vanessa sat beneath bright mirrors while flipping through a fashion magazine. A television mounted high on the wall switched from local news to breaking coverage from the game show. None of the customers paid much attention until the camera zoomed in on Marcus's face. Vanessa casually looked up for only a second before freezing completely. The magazine slipped from her hands onto the polished floor. She stared at the screen without blinking as the announcer repeated Marcus Reed's name over and over again. The same man she had believed would never recover was now standing beneath a shower of golden confetti, holding a prize larger than most people could imagine in a lifetime. The stylist quietly reached for the remote, assuming the customer wanted another channel, but Vanessa gently stopped her without saying a word. She could not look away. Back inside the television studio, Marcus thanked the host, the audience, and everyone who had believed in ordinary people willing to take one unexpected chance. He never mentioned the divorce. He never mentioned losing his home. He never spoke Vanessa's name. As the cameras continued rolling and millions celebrated his unbelievable victory, Marcus made one silent promise to himself. This fortune would never become a weapon to prove anyone wrong. It would become the foundation of a life that no one could ever take away from him again. By the following morning, Marcus could no longer walk through a grocery store without someone recognizing him. Cashiers smiled a little wider. Customers whispered as they glanced at their phones and then back at his face. Children pointed excitedly, remembering the man they had watched win the impossible prize the night before. The motel manager, who had barely spoken more than a few words to him during the previous month, suddenly insisted that Marcus did not need to worry about checking out. Immediately, and even offered him the nicest room available. Marcus thanked him politely but declined. He packed his belongings into the same 2 cardboard boxes that had followed him since the day he lost his home. They still contained the chipped coffee mug, the old baseball glove, and the family photographs he had never found the courage to unpack. Wealth had arrived overnight, but those simple reminders of his past still mattered more than expensive possessions. His phone, however, had transformed into something entirely different. Notifications poured in faster than he could read them. Television producers requested interviews. Financial advisors offered their services. Charitable organizations invited him to meetings. Business executives congratulated him on his historic victory. There were also dozens of messages from people whose names he had not seen in years. High school classmates suddenly remembered their friendship. Distant relatives wanted to reconnect. Former co-workers praised his determination as though they had always believed in him. Marcus quietly placed the phone face down on the motel table and stepped outside for fresh air. Fame, he realized, traveled even faster than money. 2 days later, he accepted an invitation to appear on a nationally syndicated morning show. The host asked what luxury car he planned to buy first and where he intended to build his dream mansion. Marcus smiled softly before surprising the audience with his answer. He admitted that the first thing he wanted was a small apartment with reliable plumbing, a comfortable bed, and windows that faced the morning sun. He explained that after sleeping in a modest motel room, simple comforts felt more valuable than extravagance. The audience applauded, not because of the money he had won, but because of the humility he had not lost. That interview spread across social media even faster than clips of the game show itself. Headlines described him as the millionaire who still carried his own luggage and thanked every employee he met. Reporters followed him through airports and parking lots, expecting dramatic displays of luxury, yet they found him donating unopened gift baskets to local shelters and quietly paying restaurant bills for strangers without introducing himself. Meanwhile, Vanessa watched every interview from the spacious living room she had fought so hard to keep. The expensive furniture, polished hardwood floors, and carefully decorated shelves suddenly felt strangely empty. Friends who had once admired her success now called only to ask whether she had really been married to the man everyone in America was talking about. She answered politely, but each conversation left behind another uncomfortable silence after the call ended. Marcus never mentioned her. Not during interviews. Not on television. Not in newspaper articles. He spoke instead about resilience, gratitude, and the unexpected kindness of people like Walter Brooks, whose simple act of generosity had changed the direction of his life. One afternoon, he returned to the quiet neighborhood where he had made that final delivery weeks earlier. Walter opened the front door with the same warm smile, although this time television crews waited discreetly across the street. Marcus embraced the elderly man, thanked him for believing in a stranger, and handed him a handwritten invitation to a private celebration that would be held the following week. Walter accepted it with tears in his eyes, unaware that the gathering Marcus was quietly organizing would soon bring together people from both his old life and his extraordinary new one. The private celebration was held 1 week later in the ballroom of a historic hotel overlooking the Atlanta skyline. It was not designed as a lavish display of wealth, but as a quiet evening of gratitude for the people who had stood beside Marcus when his life contained far more uncertainty than promise. Walter Brooks arrived wearing the same navy suit he had saved for family weddings, smiling with humble disbelief as Marcus greeted him at the entrance like an honored guest. Former co-workers from the delivery company shook his hand with genuine excitement, while local community leaders gathered to discuss the charitable foundation Marcus had announced only days earlier. Cameras remained outside. Marcus had requested that the evening stay focused on people rather than publicity. Soft piano music floated through the ballroom as guests shared conversations over simple meals instead of extravagant displays. Marcus moved from table to table, thanking everyone personally. He listened more than he spoke, remembering names, asking about families, and making each person feel seen. Success had changed his circumstances, but it had not changed the way he treated others. Near the end of the evening, the ballroom doors opened quietly, and every conversation seemed to soften without anyone asking for silence. Vanessa stepped inside wearing an elegant black dress, her posture confident, yet her eyes uncertain. She had received no invitation, but the event was impossible to miss after local newspapers mentioned its location. For a brief moment, she stood alone near the entrance, scanning the room until her eyes found Marcus speaking with Walter. She remembered another evening years earlier when they had attended a charity banquet together as husband and wife. Back then, Marcus had worn an inexpensive suit because they were saving money for the future they planned to build together. She had worried about appearances. Now, Surrounded by successful business leaders and respected community members, Marcus looked exactly the same as he always had. Calm, genuine, comfortable in his own skin. The difference was no longer measured by his bank account, but by the quiet confidence he carried. Vanessa slowly walked across the ballroom until she stood only a few feet away. Marcus noticed her almost immediately. His expression remained peaceful. There was no surprise, no anger, and no satisfaction. He simply excused himself from the conversation and stepped forward with the same courtesy he had shown every guest that evening. Vanessa searched his face for resentment, but found none. She offered a small smile before speaking softly. She admitted that she knew she probably should not have come, but after watching every interview and every news report, she felt there were things left unsaid between them. Marcus listened without interrupting. The music continued playing in the background while guests respectfully gave them space without. Openly staring, Vanessa told him she had underestimated him. She confessed that she believed losing everything would break him, yet somehow it had revealed a strength she had never truly understood. Her voice trembled slightly as she admitted she missed the man who had always placed kindness before pride. Marcus thanked her for her honesty. His reply was gentle, measured, and free from bitterness. He said that life had changed both of them in ways neither could have predicted, and he sincerely hoped she would find happiness in whatever future she chose. Vanessa looked into his eyes for several long seconds, realizing that she was no longer speaking to the man she had left behind. The Marcus standing before her had survived disappointment, rebuilt himself from almost nothing, and discovered a peace that no amount of money alone could ever purchase. As the orchestra finished its final song, she gathered the courage to ask the one question that had been echoing in her mind ever since the night she watched him on television. Vanessa finally asked the question she had carried with her ever since the night she saw Marcus standing beneath the brilliant lights of the television studio. In a voice barely louder than a whisper, she asked whether he had ever thought about giving their marriage another chance if life had unfolded differently. The ballroom seemed to grow quieter, not because people were listening, but because the moment itself carried a weight that neither of them could ignore. Marcus did not answer immediately. He looked toward the tall windows where the Atlanta skyline shimmered against the evening sky. Just a few months earlier, he would have given almost anything to hear those words. Back then, he had believed that losing Vanessa meant losing his future. Now he understood something entirely different. His future had begun the moment he stopped measuring his worth through someone else's opinion. He turned back toward her with a calm expression that held neither triumph nor regret. Before he could speak, one of the event coordinators approached to let him know that several community leaders were ready for the announcement of the new educational foundation. Marcus thanked her politely and excused himself for just a moment. Vanessa remained standing where she was, watching him cross the ballroom. Everywhere he walked, people greeted him with genuine respect rather than admiration for his wealth alone. They valued his character, his humility, and the hope he inspired. Marcus stepped onto the small stage prepared for the evening's closing remarks. He thanked every guest for attending and shared his vision of creating scholarships, financial literacy programs, and emergency housing assistance for families facing unexpected hardships. The applause that followed was sincere and heartfelt. As he stepped down from the stage, a local television reporter approached with a microphone for a brief interview. Smiling professionally, she asked if any special guests had attended the celebration. Marcus glanced across the room and noticed Vanessa still standing quietly near the entrance. Without hesitation or discomfort, he answered with complete composure. He said that many meaningful people from different chapters of his life had been present that evening. Then, with a gentle smile, he looked in Vanessa's direction and added, "That is my former wife, Vanessa." There was no bitterness in his voice, no sarcasm, no attempt to embarrass her. Just a simple statement delivered with dignity and respect. The reporter nodded and continued asking about the foundation, never realizing how powerful those few words had been. Vanessa lowered her eyes for a brief moment. She understood instantly what Marcus had done without intending to hurt her. He had introduced her honestly, kindly, and without pretending the past had never happened. More importantly, he had not defined himself through that past anymore. She was no longer the center of his story. She had become one chapter among many. As the evening drew to a close, guests slowly made their way toward the exits. Walter Brooks stopped beside Marcus and quietly told him that he had become the kind of man every parent hoped their child would grow into. Marcus smiled with quiet gratitude and thanked him once again for handing a tired delivery driver a simple flyer on an ordinary afternoon. Across the room, Vanessa picked up her purse and walked toward the exit. Before leaving, she turned one last time. Marcus happened to meet her eyes from across the ballroom. Neither of them waved. Neither of them spoke. They simply exchanged a quiet look filled with understanding. In that silent moment, Vanessa realized that the greatest distance between them had never been created by money, success, or even divorce. It had been created by the person Marcus had become after surviving the loss of everything. And she knew with absolute certainty that no amount of wealth could ever persuade him to become the man she had once left behind. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Marcus had never imagined possible. The headlines gradually shifted toward news stories. The television cameras appeared less often, and the constant ringing of his phone finally began to slow. For the first time in months, he discovered something even more valuable than financial security. He found peace. Instead of chasing attention, he spent his mornings visiting the offices of the Marcus Reed Foundation, where plans that had once existed only in notebooks slowly became reality. Scholarships were awarded to students whose dreams had nearly ended because of financial hardship. Emergency grants helped families remain in their homes after unexpected setbacks. Small business owners received opportunities to rebuild after difficult seasons. Every letter of gratitude Marcus received reminded him of the lonely nights he had spent inside the modest motel room wondering whether life would ever become meaningful again. The fortune had opened doors, but compassion determined which ones he chose to walk through. Several months later, Marcus drove alone through the neighborhood where he had once stood beside two cardboard boxes after losing everything. The familiar streets looked almost unchanged. Children still rode bicycles beneath the tall trees. Neighbors still waved from their front porches. He slowed as he passed the house that had once been his home. Fresh flowers decorated the front walkway, and someone had painted the front door a different color. Marcus smiled gently before continuing. Without stopping, he no longer felt the need to revisit memories that had already taught him everything they could. Across town, Vanessa had quietly begun rebuilding her own life as well. She accepted that some opportunities, once lost, could not be recovered simply by wishing for another chance. Watching Marcus move forward with grace had forced her to examine her own choices more honestly than ever before. She no longer blamed circumstances or bad timing. She understood that people often recognize the value of kindness only after it is gone. Although they never returned to the relationship they once shared, both of them carried forward lessons that neither success nor failure could erase. One crisp autumn afternoon, Marcus visited the small park where he had often sat alone before work during the darkest chapter of his life. The same oak trees stretched toward the sky, and children laughed as they chased one another across the grass. He carried nothing except a cup of black coffee in the same style of paper cup he used to buy when every dollar mattered. Sitting on the familiar bench, he watched the sunlight filter through the leaves and realized how strange life could be. The greatest turning point had not been the moment confetti filled the television studio. It had begun much earlier, on the day he chose not to surrender after losing everything he believed defined him. Winning the prize had transformed his circumstances, but surviving heartbreak had transformed his character. As the afternoon breeze carried fallen leaves across the walking path, Marcus quietly stood and continued toward the parking lot with an easy smile. There was no crowd waiting to applaud him, no cameras following his steps, and no audience expecting another miracle. There was only a man who had learned that dignity grows strongest in silence, that hope often arrives disguised as an ordinary opportunity, and that the richest life is measured not by the size of a bank account, but by the number of lives touched with kindness. Marcus started his car, looked once more at the peaceful park through the windshield, and drove toward the future without looking back, knowing that he had not truly won because fortune had found him. He had won because when life took away everything he owned, it failed to take away the person he chose to become.